Hey, my name is Nate. I'm 30 years old, and I run a little bookstore and cafe called the Tide Line, right on the harbor in a small coastal town called Driftwood Cove, Oregon. It's one long, narrow room with creaking floors. The smell of old paper and fresh coffee tangled together. A wood stove in the corner that I light the second the fog rolls in off the water. And a window seat where the regulars argue about the tide tables. I bought the place from the previous owner 6 years ago with money I didn't really have and a stubbornness I definitely did. And I've spent every year since slowly turning it from a dusty, used bookshop nobody visited into the kind of place where half the town drifts in on a Saturday morning without quite knowing why they came. I like it that way. Quiet, steady, full of other people's stories instead of my own. Because my own story, for a long time, was a short and simple one. A man who'd loved exactly once, lost, and decided that running a bookstore in a small town was a perfectly good way to spend a life without ever having to risk that particular kind of damage again. I want to tell you about the night that simple story stopped being true, because it started the way nothing in my life had ever started. It started with a complete stranger sliding into my booth, grabbing my hand so hard it almost hurt, and whispering 5 words against my ear like her life depended on it. "Kiss me. My ex just walked in." And before my brain had caught up with my body, I had already done exactly what she asked. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring, the kind where the rain comes in soft gray sheets off the harbor and everyone in town finds an excuse to be somewhere warm. I was in my own café after hours, which I do most nights, sitting in the back booth with a ledger and a cup of coffee gone cold, doing the math on a roof repair I couldn't really afford. The front door was technically locked, but I'd left the bell unhooked for my part-time barista, Priya, who sometimes came back for her jacket, so when it jingled I didn't even look up right away. I heard footsteps, fast, and then the bench across from me dipped hard, and a woman I had never seen in my life was suddenly sitting where my ledger had just been, breathing like she'd run the length of the harbor road. She had dark hair coming loose from a bun, a green coat dusted with rain, and eyes that were darting toward the front window with the particular wide, cornered look of someone who has just made a very bad mistake walking into a very small town. Before I could say a word, she reached across the table, grabbed my hand in both of hers, and leaned in so close I could smell rain and salt on her skin. And she whispered, fast and shaking, "I am so sorry. I know this is insane, but my ex just walked in and he cannot see me alone right now. Please, just for a second, kiss me like you mean it." And I looked past her, through the window, and saw a man in an expensive coat pause on the sidewalk outside, scanning the street, and something about the stillness in his shoulders made the decision for me before I'd consciously made it at all. I leaned in and I kissed her. It was, for the record, the strangest 30 seconds of my entire life, and also, though I would never have admitted it out loud that night, one of the best. Her hand came up and curled into the front of my shirt, and for a moment the whole cafe, the cold coffee, the roof repair I couldn't afford, all of it just stopped existing. When we finally broke apart, both of us a little breathless, she kept her eyes on me instead of the window, like she was too afraid to look, and I glanced past her shoulder. The man outside had moved on, unhurried, the way people do when they've checked a box and found nothing, and a moment later he was gone around the corner toward the harbor. "He's gone," I said quietly. She let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, and her hands, I noticed, were shaking against my chest. "Oh my God," she said, and sat back fast, putting half the table between us again, her face flooding red. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I panicked. I saw him through the window, and you probably think I'm out of my mind." "A little," I admitted. "But mostly I think you're cold and scared and the door's locked. So you're safe in here either way." That seemed to undo something in her. She put both hands over her face for a second, and when she lowered them, her eyes were wet, and she said, "I'm Ivy Calloway. I just moved here 3 weeks ago, and I really thought this town was small enough that he'd never bother to find it. I made her a real cup of coffee, the good stuff, not the dregs from my own cold mug, and I lit the wood stove even though it was technically closed hours, And over the next half hour, Ivy Calloway told me the careful, edited version of her story, the one with the sharpest parts filed down. The way people do when they've only just met you and aren't sure yet whether you're safe. She'd come to Driftwood Cove from the city, she said, to start over, and she said the word over like it cost her something. She made jewelry, small, delicate things, wire and sea glass and silver, beautiful work. She had a few pieces in her bag and showed me almost shyly. And she'd rented a tiny studio 2 streets back from the harbor with money that was, she admitted, almost gone. The man outside, she said, was named Preston Voss, and she said his name the way you'd name a weather system, something with a force and a direction of its own. He's not dangerous like in the movies, she said, like she'd had to explain this before and hated explaining it. He doesn't yell. He's just very, very good at making sure you end up exactly where he wants you, and very good at making everyone around you believe it was your idea. I didn't ask for more. I'd learned a long time ago that people tell you the rest when they're ready, not when you ask, and pushing only teaches them to go quiet again. What I told her about myself, that first night was the short version too, that I'd grown up in Driftwood Cove, that my parents had run a little fishing supply shop on the same stretch of harbor before they retired down the coast, and that I'd come back from college with a literature degree nobody needed and turned their old storage building into the tide line because I genuinely didn't know what else to do with myself. What I didn't tell her, not that night, was the other part, that there'd been a woman named Sienna, years back, who I'd planned a whole life around, and that when my mother got sick the same year I was trying to get the tide line off the ground, Sienna had looked at the long, slow grind of small-town life I was building and quietly, kindly decided it wasn't the life she wanted, and left for a city 3 states away with somebody whose future had fewer rough edges in it. I didn't blame her, not really, not anymore. But I'd learned my own lesson from it. The same way Ivy had clearly learned hers from Preston Voss. And my lesson was simpler. Don't build your whole life around someone who might. On some ordinary Tuesday, decide you're not worth the trouble. Books don't leave. A bookstore doesn't leave. I'd made my peace with that years ago. I just hadn't expected a stranger with sea glass earrings to march into my cafe and quietly start dismantling it within the first 10 minutes of knowing her. The thing about Sienna, if I'm honest, is that she wasn't wrong to leave, which is its own kind of hard to live with. The year my mother got sick was the same year I'd sunk every dollar I had into gutting my parents' old storage building, ripping out 40 years of fishing net racks and rebuilding the place shelf by shelf with my own hands, working until midnight and then driving 40 minutes to sit in a hospital chair until visiting hours ended. Sienna had been patient for a long time. She used to bring me sandwiches at the work site and pretend she didn't mind the sawdust on everything we owned. But there's a difference between being patient and being willing to live inside someone else's hard season forever. And one night she sat me down at our kitchen table, not cruel about it, never cruel. That was the worst part, and told me she didn't think she was the kind of person who could be happy in a town this small, with a life this slow, no matter how much she loved me. She moved 3 states away within the month, and I finished the bookstore alone, and my mother got better, slowly. And the tide line opened on a gray morning with exactly 4 customers, 2 of whom were my parents. I told myself, standing behind that counter for the first time, that I'd built something that couldn't leave, and for 6 years that had been more than enough. It had never once occurred to me that the thing missing wasn't permanence. It was just somebody worth being patient for. Ivy left that night, with her coat still damp and an open invitation to come back whenever she wanted real coffee, instead of whatever she'd been drinking, and I told myself that was the end of it. A strange, lovely, one-time thing. A story I'd maybe tell Priya and never anyone else. But Driftwood Cove is a town of about 1,100 people, with exactly 1 grocery store, 1 hardware store, and 1 harbor road that everyone eventually walks down. And 3 days later, Ivy came into the tide line again, this time in daylight, and bought a book of poetry and a coffee and sat in the window seat for 2 hours, sketching jewelry designs on café napkins. And the day after that, she came back again. Within 2 weeks, it had become a quiet, unspoken thing. Ivy at the window seat most afternoons, the 2 of us trading book recommendations and bad jokes. Priya, watching the whole thing develop with the barely contained glee of a 23-year-old who has correctly identified a slow-burn romance before either party involved, has noticed it themselves. I started looking forward to 2 o'clock in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in years. And then, on a gray Thursday, about 3 weeks after that first night, the bell over the door rang at exactly 2:15, and I looked up smiling, expecting Ivy, and instead found Preston Voss standing in my doorway, looking around my bookstore like he was pricing it for demolition. He was, I'll admit, exactly what I'd pictured from the way Ivy said his name. Tall, expensively dressed in a way that looked deliberately casual, with the kind of smile that arrives a half-second before the eyes do. "Afternoon," he said, looking around at my shelves, my wood stove, my chalkboard menu, with an expression of mild, polite amusement, like a man inspecting a charming but ultimately disposable curiosity. "Quite a place. You're Nate, I take it? I've heard about you." I came around the counter slowly. "Can I help you find something?" "Actually, yes," he said, still smiling. "I'm looking for Ivy Calloway. I understand she's been spending a lot of time here. I just want to talk to her. We have some unfinished business. Financial business, mostly. Nothing dramatic. And I think it would go a lot smoother for everyone if she'd just talked to me directly instead of having half the town run interference." He said it lightly, reasonably, the way a man says something he's said 100 times before and expects to work every time. "I don't know where she is right now," I said, which was true. "And if she wanted to talk to you, I imagine she would." Preston's smile didn't move, but something behind it did, just slightly. A flicker of the same cold patience I'd later come to recognize as his most dangerous quality. "Of course," he said. "Tell her I stopped by. Tell her, and this part's important, tell her the offer's still on the table, but it won't be forever." He left a business card on my counter on his way out, and I stood there holding it for a long moment, looking at the embossed letters, Voss Capital Partners, and felt the same cold settle in my chest that I imagine settles in anyone who's just shaken hands with a problem. When Ivy came in an hour later, I didn't have to say anything. She saw my face and stopped halfway across the room, and I watched 10 different kinds of dread cross her expression in about 2 seconds. "He came here," she said. It wasn't a question. I told her everything. The financial business, the offer still on the table, the half-the-town running interference line that had been needling at me ever since he said it. Ivy sat down hard in the window seat, and for the first time since I'd known her, she told me the rest of it, the part she'd filed down before. Preston Voss hadn't just been her boyfriend. He'd been her business partner, 3 years ago. When she was first starting out, he'd invested in her jewelry line, fronted the money for her first real studio and her first wholesale orders. And in exchange, he'd taken what she'd thought. At 24 was a generous, reasonable cut. It wasn't until 2 years in, when she tried to leave both the relationship and the arrangement at the same time, that she discovered the contract he'd had her sign gave him a controlling stake in anything bearing her name. Her designs, her branding, even technically future work, unless she bought him out at a price deliberately set just out of reach. "He's not trying to get me back," she said quietly, staring at her hands. "He's trying to get the business back, or get paid for letting it go. He's been emailing for months. I thought if I just disappeared somewhere small enough, he'd decide I wasn't worth the gas money to chase. I was wrong. I want to tell you I had some brilliant plan at that point, but mostly what I had was the same stubborn, slow-burning anger I'd felt watching my own parents get squeezed by suppliers who knew exactly how much pressure a small business could take before it broke. "Okay," I said. "First thing, do not meet him alone. Anywhere. Not for coffee, not to just talk it out, nothing. Second thing, do you have a copy of that contract?" She did, somewhere in a box she hadn't fully unpacked. "Third thing," I said, and this part came out steadier than I felt, "you're not going anywhere. Not the studio, not the town. We're going to figure this out, and we're going to do it with you standing still instead of running, because running is exactly what he's counting on." Ivy looked at me for a long moment, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not quite hope, more like the cautious unfreezing of someone who's forgotten what it feels like to have backup. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked. "You barely know me. You kissed a stranger because she asked you to, and now you're declaring war on a venture capitalist over a coffee subscription." I almost laughed. "Because," I said, "3 weeks ago a woman grabbed my hand and asked me to pretend, for 30 seconds, that she belonged to someone who'd fight for her. And I've been thinking about those 30 seconds every day since, and I'd really rather it stopped being pretend." That night, after Ivy had gone back to her studio, I sat alone in the back booth for a long time with Preston's business card on the table in front of me, and I thought about my parents years ago, when the wholesale supplier they'd depended on for 30 years suddenly doubled its prices the same month. A big chain opened a fishing supply store on the highway, betting correctly that a small family business would either pay up or quietly fold. They'd paid up for a while, and it had cost them nearly everything they'd put aside. And the only reason they'd come through it at all was that half the harbor had started buying their nets and tackle out of simple, stubborn loyalty. The same way this whole town buys books from a man with a literature degree and no head for business. Because that's what small places do when they decide something is worth keeping. Sitting there, I realized I wasn't actually worried about whether Ivy could win against Preston Voss on paper. Marguerite would handle the paper. What I was worried about was whether Ivy still believed, after 3 years of being slowly convinced otherwise, that she was the kind of person worth a town showing up for. So the next morning, before I'd even fully decided to, I mentioned to Priya, who mentioned it to her uncle, who mentioned it to half the harbor by lunchtime, that the woman who made the sea glass jewelry everyone kept asking about was having a little trouble with an old business partner, and wouldn't it be a shame if he showed up to a town that had already decided whose side it was on. Ivy found out what I'd done 2 days later, when she walked into the Tide line and found 3 separate customers asking, with elaborate casualness, whether she had any new pieces for sale, and Mrs. Halloway from the post office stopping her on the sidewalk to say, apropos of nothing, that she'd heard some city fellow had been asking around, and that people here don't much care for that sort of thing. Ivy came and sat down across from me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between exasperated and undone. "You told the whole town," she said. "I told Priya one fact," I said. "And then I got out of the way because that's how this place works. You don't have to fight him alone, Ivy. You never did. You just hadn't been here long enough to know that yet." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. And then she said very softly, "In 3 years, Preston never once let anyone else know what was happening. Not because he hid it, because he made sure I felt like it would be embarrassing if anyone found out, like it was my failure, my bad judgment, mine to fix quietly. I didn't even think to ask for help. I just thought about disappearing again." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "That's the part I want to fix most," I said. "Not the contract. That. The disappearing part." She looked up at me, and there were tears standing in her eyes that didn't fall, and she said, "Nobody's ever made me feel less embarrassed about needing help. They usually make it worse." "Then I guess," I said, "we're starting a new tradition around here." She didn't say anything to that for a long moment, and the cafe was very quiet except for the rain starting up again on the windows. And then Ivy reached across the table. The same table, I realized, the exact same booth, and put her hand over mine, the way she had that first night, except this time nobody was watching through the window, and nobody needed convincing. "I'd really like that too," she said, soft and a little unsteady. And this time, when we kissed, there was no audience to perform for and nothing to hide from. Just the rain and the wood stove and 3 weeks of 2 o'clock afternoons finally arriving somewhere honest. If you've ever spent weeks circling something you were afraid to name, only to have it land all at once in a quiet room with nobody watching, you know exactly the particular kind of relief that is. The next few days were some of the best I could remember in years, even with Preston Voss's shadow still hanging somewhere off the edge of things. Ivy started showing me her studio, 2 streets back from the harbor, a single bright room with a workbench covered in tiny pliers and spools of wire and jars of sea glass she'd collected off the beach herself, sorted by color like a painter's palette. She showed me how she annealed silver wire over a tiny torch, how she chose each piece of glass for the way light moved through it, and she let me hold a half-finished pendant while she talked, like it was the most natural thing in the world to trust me with something she'd made. I told her, watching her work, that it reminded me of shelving books, the way you learn, eventually, which things belong next to which other things, not by rule but by feel. She looked up at that and said, "That might be the nicest thing anyone's compared my jewelry to." And I said, "I have a whole bookstore full of nice things to compare it to, if you're interested." And she laughed, really laughed, in a way that made the whole cramped little studio feel bigger. We started having dinner most evenings after the Tide line closed. Nothing fancy, soup and bread at her place or mine. Priya teasing us both relentlessly the next morning because apparently the whole town had clocked it before we had. For the first time since Siena, I caught myself thinking less about all the ways a life could come apart, and more about all the small, ordinary ways it could simply keep going together. Over the next 2 weeks, Driftwood Cove did the thing small towns do best, which is decide collectively, almost overnight, that one of their own was under threat and rally without anyone formally asking them to. Ivy found her old contract in a box of winter sweaters, and I drove her 2 hours to the county seat to see a lawyer named Marguerite Oduya, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in exactly the kind of predatory small business contracts Preston Voss apparently wrote for a living, and who took one look at the document and said with real relish, "Oh, this is sloppy." He got greedy. There's a clause in here about creative output that's so broad it's actually unenforceable. A judge would laugh him out of the room, it turned out. Preston's whole strategy depended on people being too scared, too broke, or too far away to actually fight back. And Ivy, for the first time in 3 years, was none of those things. Marguerite drafted a formal response. Not a lawsuit, just a very calm, very precise letter laying out exactly which clauses were unenforceable, and exactly what would happen to Preston's reputation among other small investors if this particular contract ever became public. Meanwhile, word had quietly gone around the harbor, the way it does, and when Preston Voss came back to Driftwood Cove 10 days later, smug, unhurried, clearly expecting the small-town routine to have worn Ivy down, he found the Tide line's window seat occupied not by a frightened woman alone, but by Ivy, me, Marguerite's letter in a folder on the table, and at the next table over, very deliberately, Priya's uncle, who happened to be the harbor's only practicing attorney and an old friend of Marguerite's, drinking coffee and reading the local paper with great interest. Preston's smile faltered for the first time since I'd met him. He sat down without being asked, and Ivy, calm in a way I hadn't seen from her before, slid the folder across the table. "I had this looked at," she said. "Properly looked at. The creative output clause won't hold up, and Marguerite Oduya thinks a few of your other investors might be interested to know how it's worded." "I'm not interested in fighting you, Preston. I'm interested in you signing the release on page 4 and never contacting me again. That's the whole offer. It won't be forever either." For a moment, he just looked at her, and I watched him run the same calculation Royce Calhoun and Julian Pierce and men like them always seem to run, the quick, cold math of whether a fight was worth the exposure. And then, the way they always do, he found a way to make the retreat sound like his idea. "You've gotten very confident," he said, with the ghost of his old smile. "Small towns suit you, I suppose." "They do," Ivy said. "Turns out people here actually show up." He signed the release. He left a 20 on the table for a coffee he never drank, which felt somehow like the most honest thing he'd ever done, and he didn't come back to Driftwood Cove again. That night, the Tide line stayed open late. Not for business, just for us. The wood stove going, the chairs up on the tables except for the one booth in the back. Ivy sat across from me with the signed release folded carefully in front of her, like she still couldn't quite believe it was real, and she looked up at me and said, "3 weeks ago, I grabbed a stranger's hand because I was terrified and out of options. And somehow that turned into the first time in 3 years I've felt like I had any options at all." I reached across and laced my fingers through hers, the same hand, the same booth. "For what it's worth," I said, 3 weeks ago a woman grabbed my hand and I spent 30 seconds being braver than I'd been in about 5 years. I've been trying to live up to it ever since," she smiled. and there was a little salt in it, the good kind. And she leaned across the table, slowly this time, with no ex-boyfriend in sight, no audience, nothing to perform, and kissed me like she meant every part of it, which this time we both knew she did. That was almost a year ago now. A few weeks after Preston left, the harbor put on its annual spring festival. The kind of small-town event where the whole main street closes for an afternoon and everyone sets up a folding table to sell whatever they make. Jam, carved driftwood, knitted hats, whatever a person's been quietly working on all winter. Ivy had never set up a table before. In 3 years with Preston, she told me, every piece she made had technically belonged to someone else before it even left her hands. And the idea of standing behind her own work, in public, with her own name on it, made her more nervous than the lawyer's office ever had. I helped her carry a folding table down to the harbor that morning, and she arranged her sea glass pieces on a square of blue cloth with the same careful attention she gave everything. And then she stood there for a long moment just looking at it, her own name on a little hand-lettered sign, Callaway Designs, and I watched her take a breath like she was stepping into cold water. By noon, there was a small crowd around her table, and by 2 o'clock, she'd sold almost everything she'd brought. And Mrs. Halloway bought a pair of earrings and loudly informed everyone within earshot that she'd known the girl had talent the moment she walked into the post office, which was generous, considering Mrs. Halloway had mostly just glared at Ivy's wet umbrella that first week. I stood at the edge of the crowd with 2 cups of cider, watching Ivy laugh and wrap a necklace in tissue paper for a tourist from Portland, and I thought, not for the first time, that there is a particular kind of beauty in watching someone become, in public, the person they were always capable of being, once nobody was standing on their air hose anymore. That evening, after the festival had wound down and the folding tables were stacked along the harbor wall, Ivy and I walked back to the tide line in the blue early evening light, her now empty cloth tucked under one arm, and she was quieter than she'd been all day. I asked if she was okay, and she said she was, more than okay, and then she stopped walking, right there on the harbor road, and turned to face me. "I keep thinking about that first night," she said. "How if Preston hadn't walked past your window at exactly that moment, none of this would have happened. I'd probably still be in that studio, terrified every time the bell over my own door rang, still thinking I had to handle everything alone and quietly, the way he taught me to." She looked down at the empty cloth in her arms, then back up at me. "I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was meeting him. Now I think it might secretly be the best, because it's the reason I was standing on that sidewalk on that exact Tuesday, scared enough to do something completely insane. And you were the insane thing I did." I laughed and pulled her in, right there on the harbor road with the gulls wheeling overhead and the last of the festival lights strung along the water. And I said, for the record, I'd take that deal again. Every single time. She tucked herself against my side as we walked the rest of the way home, and the tide line's windows glowed warm and gold ahead of us, the way they had that very first rainy night, except this time there was nothing to hide from on either side of the glass. Ivy's studio is 2 streets back from the harbor, same as ever, except now there's a small brass plaque by the door that says Callaway Designs. No Voss anywhere in sight, and her jewelry is in 3 shops up and down the coast, and, as of last month, in a little display case by the register at the tide line, because half my regulars kept asking where they could buy the necklace. The lady in the window seat always wears. Priya has never once let either of us forget that she called the whole thing within 10 minutes of meeting Ivy, and she's not wrong, and she will absolutely never let it go. Marguerite Oduya comes up the coast for dinner every few months and pretends she doesn't enjoy hearing how the case turned out, though she keeps a framed copy of Preston's signed release in her office, which she says is for morale. Even Sienna, oddly enough, has a small part in how things turned out. Ivy found her on a whim. On one of the jewelry forums, Sienna apparently still posted in under a different name, and the 2 of them got to talking before either realized the connection. And Sienna ended up being the one to point Ivy toward Marguerite in the first place, an old law school friend from years back. When I found out, I half expected it to feel strange, some old wound reopening. Instead, Sienna sent a short, kind message saying she was glad I'd found my way to someone who actually wanted to stay. And I realized that some doors, once you've made peace with them being closed, can be opened again for no reason except generosity. And that's its own kind of ending, too. And some afternoons, when the fog rolls in soft and gray off the harbor the way it did that first Tuesday, Ivy still slides into the back booth at 2 o'clock. And I still make her the good coffee, and every now and then, for no reason at all except that we can, one of us leans across the table and says quietly, "Kiss me." And the other one always says yes. Because some pretend things, it turns out, were never really pretend at all. They were just waiting for someone brave enough to make them true. People ask me sometimes how Ivy and I got together, and I never know how to make it sound like anything but exactly what it was, which is the strangest, smallest, truest love story I know. A frightened woman slid into a stranger's booth on a rainy Tuesday and asked him to be brave for 30 seconds, and he was. And it turned out 30 seconds was all either of them needed to start becoming the people they'd both quietly given up on being. I'd spent years telling myself that books don't leave, that a quiet bookstore in a small town was a safe enough life, that I'd made my peace with never risking that particular kind of damage again. And then a woman with sea glass in her pocket and rain in her hair grabbed my hand and asked me to pretend, just for a moment, that she belonged to someone who'd fight for her. And it turns out that's the kind of moment you don't get to take back, even if you wanted to. Especially if you don't. So if you're waiting for some big, perfect, obvious sign that someone is worth the risk, I can tell you from experience it probably won't look like that at all. It might just look like a stranger sliding into your booth on an ordinary Tuesday, grabbing your hand and whispering 5 words that change absolutely everything. And if you're lucky, if you're very, very lucky, you'll do exactly what I did. You'll say yes before you've even finished deciding to.